absolute honor to introduce Doug, who I think to this group probably needs no introduction, but I'm going to try anyway. I think it's entirely appropriate that you hear from Doug this morning. When I think about technology innovation, I divide it into two sort of large general categories. One is incremental, and I think most of what we see in Silicon Valley falls into that class. However, once in a great while, there are innovations that change entire paradigms, they create new industries, and they ultimately transform societies. Doug's work, beginning in the 1950s, falls into that category. I think most of you are probably familiar with the story of how at the end of World War II, Doug discovered Vannevar Bush's Memex. This was a machine that would organize and retrieve vast amounts of human knowledge, information, mechanically. Doug's struggle with the idea of building tools to augment the human mind would ultimately give us both personal computing and the modern internet. And I think if you think about Stanford, where we are today, and you sort of dial the clock back, what you'll realize is that there were 3 laboratories that surrounded Stanford University beginning in the 1960s. We most know well of the story of Xerox PARC and how Steve Jobs borrowed the Macintosh from Xerox PARC. But personal computing did not spring like Zeus from Xerox PARC. There was a prehistory. And the prehistory took place in 2 other laboratories. One was the Stanford Artificial Intelligence Laboratory, which was run by John McCarthy, beginning in 1964. And the other was Doug's lab, ultimately Augmentation Research Center, beginning in the early 1960s. And in fact, most of the ideas of what would become the modern personal computer and the internet began in these 2 laboratories during the 1960s on opposite sides of the Stanford campus. One was engaged in replacing the human mind, McCarthy's lab, and the other, Doug's lab, was focused on augmenting the human mind. And I think it's ironic that although McCarthy's lab was the one that had the wealth of backing from the computer science industry, it was Doug's ideas that would ultimately have the most impact. I want to add just 2 stories to the sort of the Doug mythology this morning that you might not know. It's well known that when Steve Wozniak approached Hewlett-Packard in the 1970s with his personal computer, the company said no thanks. Of course, the irony here is the company that several years ago adopted the slogan "Invent" passed on one of the Valley's most significant inventions. It's also worth pointing out that more recently, HP chose to sell Apple's iPod for several years, even though it owned the intellectual property for the first MP3 player that had been invented in a digital equipment laboratory in Palo Alto. But that's another story. The story that is worth telling is the first time HP passed on computing. In the 1950s, Doug was looking for his first job as a research engineer. During his interviews, he couldn't find anyone who shared his passion for building digital computers. General Electric research labs tried to hire him, but when he broached the idea of digital computing, he came up against a stone wall. He contacted Hewlett-Packard, which was then a successful manufacturer of analog oscilloscopes in a Palo Alto factory. He spoke with Barney Oliver, the company's director of research. Oliver considered some of Engelbart's technology ideas and decided that HP might be able to harness them for some of its products. Oliver introduced Engelbart to both Hewlett and Packard, and Bill Hewlett tried to sell him on the idea of coming to work for the test equipment maker. Then Doug talked to Dave Packard. Packard suggested the company hire Doug and that the company pay him a royalty for any of his inventions. He said, everything you can disclose in the first 6 months of your employ, whether you thought about it during that time or brought it in, is yours, and everything after that is ours. Doug thought that was a great idea, and he said, sold. He was preparing to go to work for HP when, while driving home several nights later, it occurred to him that he hadn't asked the HP managers whether they planned to enter the market for digital computers. He had assumed that their instrumentation business would go in that direction, but he hadn't asked. He stopped his car and pulled over. Those are the days you had to stop your car to go to a phone booth, and called Oliver. It was a short and disappointing conversation. I assume you're going to go into digital technology, aren't you? Doug asked. The research director replied that the company had no such plans. This is the 1950s. Doug was crestfallen, but it was obvious he couldn't go to work for HP. Well, I should have found that out earlier, and I'm sorry to take your time, he said, because I just can't go ahead. So HP passed on the opportunity to lead the computer revolution long before they passed on the PC. One last story. If I can find the right page. Gordon Moore is widely credited with the 1965 observation that transistor density doubles at regular intervals. It has come to be referred to as Moore's Law, and it defines much of the modern world. But Doug was there first. Like many researchers, he began thinking about the implications of the integrated circuit in the 1950s, the late 1950s. In late 1959, he wrote a short technical article titled Microelectronics and the Art of Similitude. I invite you to Google the article and read it for yourself. It's all there. 6 years before Gordon, Doug identified the foundation of our digital economy. Doug outlined the implications of scaling first. He presented his paper at the International Circuits Conference in Philadelphia in 1960. He had proven to himself that the computing power to build his augmentation system would arrive, and of course it did. Several years ago, I had the opportunity to ask Gordon more about this. It was very intimidating, because Gordon is the closest thing to God in Silicon Valley. But he's also a very plain-spoken engineer. He simply responded to me, of course I was familiar with those ideas. I was there. I heard Doug's speech. Please welcome Doug Engelbart.
What can I say? Destroy the image? Anyway, it has been a long time of plodding along, and the sort of things, the motivations and perceptions that drove me along year after year were just large scale and very conceptual. And it was on some other pursuit about how could I turn my life's career into something that would be most meaningful to mankind. And I actually stopped and spent 2 or 3 months full-time working on that. And then one day I just said, God, it's just, all these big problems are so complex, and they're getting more and more urgent, and it's just overwhelming. They have to be dealt with collectively. You know, and all of a sudden that just dawned in on me like this, okay, that collective capability to cope with complex, urgent problems was really a serious thing, so I adopted it as a lifetime goal. I think I was only 25 or something at the time, so you can excuse me for, say, okay, I commit my lifetime to that, but it stuck. And the more I learned about it, the more I went on, and so the best I can do today is just give you a little bit of little perspectives about what that meant to me and what I still think is there for people to pursue. And I think the journalism has more of a role in it than maybe you guys anticipate. Okay. So it's clear to me then that was the collective ability, and how I clarify it now, it's like our collective ability to develop an adequate, comprehensive understanding of the problem situation, of the possible solutions, of the resources required, of the resources available, and you say, oh, now I've got an approach. But there's cyclic processes moving in along any kind of attack you're going to take on a big problem. You constantly get new kinds of big problems, etc. So your collective ability to understand and cope with complex urgent problems just seemed to me to be extremely important. And it wasn't long after that I came to the conclusion that I repeat right now, is that if humanity doesn't get better at this business of recognizing and coping with complex urgent problems, there's just a higher and higher likelihood that the whole humankind will crash. And maybe there'll be some people left alive, or poor or something like that, but it'd be a disastrous setback. And so how is it that we can prepare as a society for understanding the kind of complexity that's emergent all around us, and the kind of threats that has, but also what are the paths that lead to something you really like to see humanity arrive at. So anyway, that just seemed to me that would be very important. And so what I just came up with this sort of concept of collective IQ. See, that we have to do it collectively because that's the way we have to deal with the problems. So what's this collective capability of organization or our country or all of humanity to understand complex challenges, to find a cost-effective solution, and that's a real challenge that it can afford to implement. And collective ability to organize and carry out the solution, coping effectively with unforeseen complexities, etc. With a lot more detail, of course, you can put into that, but it just said, okay, how can we, this was back in the early 50s, and just how can we do that? So maybe what I should have done instead of trying to go with the computerized approach was just try to advertise more and more to the world about how the general need was. But for me, it just seemed like there was a path that the just emergent then computer could do a lot of good. And I even had the picture at that time of, even though the computers were great big roomfuls, like this big vacuum tube thing like this, and I think there were about 4 in the country at the time being built. You know, I just had lots of confidence about the way trends would go, and that to get started at that time would be the best thing I could do for a career. And, oops. But then, when I started thinking about it, realizing what you're talking about fundamentally are capabilities. And then it became very interesting to look at capabilities and say, oh, they really exist in the infrastructure. And your capability to hold your professional role depends upon a whole infrastructure of subordinate capabilities that you must have to do that. And it goes right down to being able to speak and write and communicate and travel. And all these things we just sort of take for granted that you've got, but somehow the society has to provide this whole infrastructure of capabilities. And then if we're talking about doing something significant about boosting the capabilities in there, there's this whole infrastructure to look at. And that infrastructure then says, all right, I'll look at that infrastructure. And then of course, since you're talking to a bunch of techie-oriented people, they'll say, you know, here's what you can do. And so I was faced with this sort of thing back in the late 60s, is that everybody was talking about office automation, et cetera, and that the technologies that come in and automate what you're doing. And you look at those capability infrastructure like that, and it says, let's see, where there is it going to fit that it just takes over and automates? I don't know about that, because one of the things that you have to appreciate is that whole capability is derived from very basic human capabilities, along with the tools, but this human system side is just inevitably, it's just the biggest part of the whole thing. And yet, we've lived with that so long, and it's understandable how the techie-oriented people says, oh boy, I got this new technology, I can plug it in and wow, take over. But you can hardly imagine a place in this capability infrastructure that you can plug in something that'll just take over that particular capability. And says no. So you start looking at that infrastructure, and you realize that essentially, or I may be jumping ahead a lot, but it came to me that the best thing you could do, because there's no way we're smart enough to redesign that whole infrastructure to get down to, you know, the way you're taught in school, and the way you write, and the way you print, and the way you talk, and the way schools work, and they're just huge, huge infrastructure of activities that comprise that capability infrastructure. And so it comes pretty soon. The best thing you can do is facilitate its evolution. And then that means a co-evolution. That means, yes, the technology is important, but you have to find the co-evolution concurrently of things in the human system side. And I had great fun just picturing what are some of the biggest impact technology artifact systems that were ever introduced that we can think of. And my favorite is to turn to agricultural tools that the hunter-gatherers could settle down and look at all the things that happened as the land ownership came there like this, and I can grow more corn than I can eat myself, so if I start trading it, well then the whole trading business started, and then the towns got going, and just a whole bunch of came after that. Or another really interesting thing is, inventing elevators. What was the tallest building we probably had before the elevators came up? And most of my friends end up thinking like maybe 6 stories or 7. And all right, but then what difference did it make within towns, within the commerce and other activity of a town, when it could go higher and the concentration of work and living could get much higher? So it's just lots and lots of impact, and that whole infrastructure occurs when you learned how to bring elevators in. And so shoes or any of those things is there as an impact. And then so computers come, and they're not just going to be all by themselves that you plug in, that they replace in the other places like this. So this was a very important kind of thing for me to arrive at. And this came to me in the 50s, something like that, I was saying. So I really tried to divorce myself from, hey, computer is automating people, etc., automating what you're doing, that it's augmenting. So if we look at that capability infrastructure more, and I've never had the patience to go into it in the kind of detail it might take, but you just build that structure. It says, if that top capability there is sort of that which supports your role as a professional, look at all the other things that depends upon your being capable of. Way off to something primitive like I gotta be able to read. I have to be able to drive a car. I have to be able to recognize what a telephone is and to use it, and things of that sort. So huge number of capabilities that we just take for granted, but they represent this infrastructure that augments us from being the basic human being that is there, is smart and intelligent, has perceptive powers and such, and then could learn so many things in the way of skills and attitudes, etc., and fit within an infrastructure like this that augments the people. So it'd be interesting to say, as this evolves and matures, there's a capability in there for that society that it has to have sort of the equivalent of sensory and perceptual apparatus going that's on this social nature about what's happening that's critical and important to our activity, survival, existence, etc., as a community. And so I've really enjoyed learning more about how the human systems activate the human itself capabilities down there, and the really critical importance of this thing they call perception. And I don't know how everyone else has ever much learned about it, but it didn't come to me as a natural. But you receive all sorts of sensory things all the time: smell, visual, audio, something like this, tactile. And yet, what you do about those depends so much on that perceptual thing. It's like you're sitting there now. You're basically comfortable. You're listening to me talk. There's a flow of audio waves coming to you. And boy, you don't crank away inside of there. Let's see, there's a word like this. No, the flow of it is just received by you as a meaning, developing meanings. And there's that. What I attribute is to that perceptual machinery in there in your head. So you look at that and say, what are basic human capabilities, things of that sort have been going. What's the equivalent in this larger infrastructure of capabilities? So that larger infrastructure needs the equivalent of sensory and perceptual. It says, maybe that's what journalism provides. And that's what I would like to offer to you, to tell you that this is the role, essentially, of how the society receives its sensory inputs And then the perceptual part of that thing is hugely affected by the interpretive way in which the journalism produces that for people and shapes it. So this social structure that you're fit within just is ever more dependent upon you guys as the world gets larger, moves faster, etc. Is how do the general feeling of the whole country and its cumulative collective perception and understanding depends so much upon that. So I can go ahead here and talk about it, but this is the kind of thing I wanted to get across, that to me it's extremely important. And I hate to belabor you and say, oh, now you have to feel like without you as the sensory and partially perceptual machinery for society, what would we do? We'd be blind and deaf, couldn't touch anything. And so then if all you did was just basically report the factual aspects of the news without any kind of interpretive sort of thing, we would have the sensory part of the thing going, but we wouldn't have that perceptual facilitation that it gets to going. So very, very important. And let's see, so that's the best I think I can make you feel so far in this talk. Should I sit? How many more minutes? What?
You have another 15 minutes if you wish, but you will be chairing the panel that follows, including David Nordfors and Turo Uskali, who are both there with you now. And I believe that it would be appropriate if we could hold our questions for you, Doug, until after the panel. But if you wish to start your panel now with David and with Turo, that might be appropriate. Up to you.
Yeah. All right. Unaccustomed as I am, I think I'll go ahead a little bit more. And then one of the fun and exciting things about growing old is you start having interesting effects on your memory. So I'd be really curious about what it is I was going to say next. So anyway, look at what scale does this augmentation model work at? And I contend that it works over this whole scale. And then there's something that was mentioned earlier about scaling. That my first job when I came to this area before I went back to Berkeley graduate school was in aeronautic at Moffett Field. And I remember learning from the aeronautical scientists, I was curious about how you can test a little wing foil or something in a wind tunnel and then decide what that's going to mean in a great big wing. And so they explained to me that there was a whole science of scaling, is a formal name they have for it, and the kind of ways you could sort of calculate on that goes. And that interested me much, so later I gave a talk about scaling, and it went to like a room full of people and says, if this room and everybody and everything in it suddenly got 10 times larger, would you notice? And you see people looking around and saying, well, that funny looking guy over there is going to be 10 times taller, but he's 10 times farther away and 10 times wider, and optically everything would look the same. And well, we wouldn't notice it, they'd say, yeah, okay, how much heavier would you be? And then you stop and think a little bit, well, 10 by 10 by 10 is 1,000 times the volume, so I'd be 1,000 times heavier. Wow, you know. All right, how much stronger would you be? And everybody looks and just sort of feels like, wow, 1,000 times stronger. So no, your strength is proportional cross-section area of muscles and bones. So you'd only be 100 times stronger, but 1,000 times heavier. So what do you think would happen? That's like now suddenly you weigh 10 times more without getting any stronger. So like 1,000 pounds, what do you think you could do with that? What would your chair do? See, you say, oh, this scaling business is serious, isn't it? It really is. So then you realize that as you change scale going downwards, that you find really different phenomena, and the interaction between the different phenomena will all shift and change. So that for sure, if you just reduce sizes by a factor of 1,000, you'll find new different phenomena that you would latch together to make devices. So I just said, look, it looks like we're going to be able to have all the computing power we ever want. And I didn't know what was going to happen to it, but it just seemed to me something great. We could go ahead and count on that. And it turned out there was a young guy named Gordon Moore in the audience, which was really a kick to learn about later. Anyway, the same thing goes true in the other direction with when you're talking about a world that's getting bigger, you know, the number of people going up, so the complexity and the scale goes up, and the quantity of produce and everything else that has to be dealt with goes up. So it's not just simply doubling your capability to do something, because you got up there and you got n times as much of this or that to go on. So dealing with scale is something that takes special thinking, special rationale. And so for sure, if you're thinking about the scale of our economy and populace going up, that there are just going to be really, really different problems and challenges that we have to learn how to cope with. Well, then the journalism should be ready for that. And then you look at the journalism thing, if you have n times as many events happening in the world, and n times the complexity of interaction and effects between them, then journalism becomes much, much different. You can say, you can report on events, but how do you give the journalistic assessment? And a whole twist to it that I feel journalism really depends. So this is going to be a challenge for you guys in the future, that the continuing scaling of events and the rate at which they happen, and the complexity of the potential implications of the events that you're going to report on. So this is all I can do is say, from my experience, that complexity is going to go up as, I don't know whether it's the cube or the square or what of the population and the economic activity and all of that in the world, but it's going up. And are you guys going to be ready? And are you thinking about it? So, would you like to have me get to something that was good news? I don't know. Anyway, this kind of scaling is just really something, and I say that this augmentation model is going to be valid over that, but has to deal with it. So if this society, if its sensory and perceptual machinery that the scale of a society goes on, then the journalism has to start becoming much more aware of those kind of role capabilities that you have to provide. That, you know, the perceptual thing, like when something happens over here that seems like just a little bit of an increase in somebody's rate of doing something, and the implications that has, and you already know that, I already know that, I read about things like that in there, but the awareness of that and has to start getting better and better, because with the scale of our population, the scale of the economies and all of that goes, so goes the complexity of almost all of the reactions to different phenomena. Would you like me to find something pleasant and cheerful to say about it? I'm not sure I can do that, but anyway, that scale is it matters a great deal. And you know, I could give the same presentation in the digital world about reducing the scale of the components. Yes, it's going to be a big thing, a big factor. On the other hand, the scale of utilization and the integration of digital stuff into society, the scale of the complexity of the world, of the interconnectedness of it, those are all things that as the size and scale of rate of things happen and go up, are just going to compound the challenge to society's sensory and perceptual machinery, which is you guys, a lot. So what can I do to cheer you up? The things like, if some things start happening, there are sort of tactical moves one could adjust to take. You know, you just change this or change that. But then other things are changing at a rate and scale, so you know you have to get strategic in our world about it. That there's just no way you can increase this kind of factor in that society enough to balance it out. You know, it has to be a whole compound ratio of things that have to start changing. Well, politics being what politics are, which is a natural sort of thing, what do we have to, you know, can today's political structures, you know, lead a society that has survivable capability enough? Or do we have to really realign our ways of making some of the significant decisions for society? And I guess most people could agree that there have been examples in the last few years of decisions that were made that you have a hard time feeling that that was any kind of collective IQ example. Nothing personal to anybody. Anyway, and the paradigms are, you know, the way you think about things. So this is really, really serious. It's really clear that segments of our society have ways of thinking about things and deciding about things that would not be, could not go along with the increasing scale of activities and effects, etc. in the world. And so who's going to bring the awareness of that to the populace enough so things start getting rearranged? Or is it even possible? And so it's really nice for some of us analytic guys sitting off the side to say, okay, that's what journalism has to take care of. Hand it over to the boys, you'll do it. I can just, anyway, the way I've been thinking about these things puts that a large effect into your hands. And maybe that's what you got together today for, was to see in what way should we get more responsibility in our hands for society's dynamics. I don't hear any volunteers, so I'll go ahead. Anyway, for me, I just really keep coming back to say, this thing we call collective IQ, we just have to find a way to boost it. And you can look at, here's a picture of the world if you want to, or any organization with a lot of subunits, and they all communicate back and forth among themselves. And in some way, the kind of recorded dialogue and collection of what's going on in the world and knowledge product, that kind of things that need to go on. That's as if this were an individual's head. What you have to do with the sensory sort of and knowledge that you get, you have to be able to integrate that into the best thing I could think of as concurrently developing, integrating, and applying the knowledge. And I ended up calling it a dynamic knowledge repository that is the next thing to what sits in your head is a structured, interrelated set of understanding and knowledge in your head, such that perceptually you can look at an event and bingo, you recognize and fit it right into the world. So, anyway, I think it's the collective idea is a really acute thing. So,
yeah, hi. Can you just compare what you're describing to some of the things we're seeing in terms of the emergence of...
Excuse me, we would like to accept the questions after the panel discussion that follows Dr. Engelbart's opening address. Thank you. Go ahead, Doug.
maybe you just rescued me. I appreciate the questions. How many more minutes have I already shot?
About 1 minute.
Thank you. Well, anyway, the thing I call a dynamic knowledge repository ends up emerging over these years as a kind of critical thing that we can learn to do to sort of support the idea of a collective IQ. And I don't know anything else, but where the information would come from would be journalism. But it's building this repository to be meaningfully structured so that the different arguments, pro and con, are dealt with in ways in which you can come in and see the current status of contrary attitudes and opinions and how these are beginning to overcome one another or something. anyway, there are practices that have been evolving in the last years. They're called structured argumentation. And if you have hyperlinks that can point right to different passages effectively, then you can make these structures with links forming like this to actually show the status of the argumentation about some given issue. And it may not show that there's a resolution, but it'll show you the status. And that's bound to evolve, etc. So can you make a web-based base of knowledge about complex problems in our world that get more and more complete, and the arguments can be clarified, or finally that depends upon the accuracy of one of these different situations. Anyway, my feeling is that we can do that, and that would be extremely important, and it would be very important, I guess, for journalisms to play a role, and they may be able to play the role about getting the world realizing that can happen and actually setting the stage for doing it. So I'll turn it over to you and say, I'll just wait and see what your DKRs come out to be like.
Now we're going to sit down in a panel discussion with David Nordfors and Turo Uskali with Douglas Engelbart. And by the way, with respect to the scaling effect which Doug was discussing, our task as journalists is to go from data, immense amounts, to information, much smaller, maybe 10 to the third, then go from information to knowledge, again a huge scaling reduction, and then to wisdom. Wisdom doing what we write correctly about what we know to be true. I will go to the back of the audience now as David leads the panel discussion. Anyone who raises their hand, I will come to with the microphone so that you can address your questions to any three of the people on the panel. David.
Oh, right, thanks, Doug. Brilliant. Thanks. And thanks for addressing journalism. When I first read Doug's papers, they spoke to me directly. It seemed as if this actually gave a framework to what I was trying to do with this program. And when we started the Innovation Journalism program, the vision was that in order to be able to report on progress in society, one has to kind of merge business journalism and technology journalism, because business and technology was co-developing. That was the idea. And I think that the basic point here, where this fits into Doug's universe here, is you have the human system, you have the tool system. Traditionally, the tech journalism reports on the tool system, and the business journalism and political journalism and so on reports on the human system. And in the tech beat, they traditionally, I mean it's changing now, but traditionally they didn't do too much about the human system and the other way around, because they thought it was the other guy's business. Now if we look at this society, the collective intelligence here that Doug sketches, the stuff in the middle there one could also call the innovation ecosystem, because it is the society's capability of encountering problems and finding solutions to them collectively, right? What we know with innovation ecosystems is that if you ask somebody in the biotech industry, did you, what do you work with? They say, well, I'm in the biotech industry. They won't say that I'm in this or that innovation ecosystem. So innovation ecosystems sort of lack self-identity, collective identity. So the idea here is that what journalism can do, which I think would promote Doug's picture of a well-functioning collective IQ, is that innovation journalism that then can report on the interaction between the tool system and the human system will then create some kind of collective attention on things, which is a precursor to collective consciousness, which in turn is a precursor to collective identity. So my message would be that, see to that you report on how the tool system and the human system co-develops, and you will be a part of the stuff there in the middle, and as Doug's said so clearly, I mean, journalism becomes a very vital part in this organism. It becomes the kind of the perceptual capability of it. So there is the link, and I think also with Doug's thoughts, it's also natural that journalism reporting on innovation should also be innovative itself. So you have this kind of journalism driving innovation, innovation driving journalism.
David, we have a question.
Okay, yeah.
Hi, this is Eric O'Shard. I'm from Reuters. Doug, I'm interested in you applying your conceptual framework to some of the things we're seeing, like some of the collaborative capabilities that are out on the web these days, the Wikipedia being an obvious example. But there's many collaborative tools that journalists here are trying to work with. Just talk a little bit about your framework in the context of some of what exists right now.
Okay, it'd be easy for me. Is this alive? Yeah, it'd be easy for me to get very wordy about this. There'd be lots of inputs into that environment that will cause responses of adjustment and adaptation. And you know, I really have to say that I hadn't thought about that much earlier before coming to speak to you guys, how important journalism was on this scale. And the evolution inside of that would be very, very hard to design. And so I just sort of said, okay, the best you can do is facilitate it. And so journalism can have a very important role on facilitating the evolution by getting it clear about what pathways for change there really are, who's trying what, what's happening about it. And then one of the things, so is someplace we have to be aware of what are some of the social, political, religious, if you want it, kind of holdings in the world that are actually inhibiting the kind of evolution that that whole organism needs to have for its survival. And that, you know, without getting wars going about it or something, that how do you facilitate that evolution? And it's like, would it be reasonable to get this kind of an image that you guys could clarify or fix it better, that it start to be presented to the general world? Or was that something that would create so much reactionary thing? I don't know. But I was just wondering sometimes if you guys interact with sociologists and anthropologists and that sort enough to sort of help explore what is the approach that could help facilitate that evolution most.
I've got a question. I found what you had to say about, I'm Howard Lieberman from the Silicon Valley Innovation Institute, and what you had to say about scaling I think is really truly profound. I don't think the world thinks as much about scaling as it did when we traded in our slide rules for calculators, because most of the young generation doesn't know what an exponent really is. When you solve problems, you had to know the difference between 1,000 and a million and a billion and a trillion. But the thought that this brings to mind, and to connect what David said, is if something gets 1,000 times heavier and only 10 times stronger by going up, that seems to be a big problem. What about going down? What if we became the size of a fly? Then the fly is 10 times stronger, and it can fly. So it seems to me that as organizations become larger and larger and larger, they're getting weaker and weaker in terms of innovation. And the smaller entities of the 10 to 100 individuals that are connected are outperforming the larger ones because they're 10 times stronger in proportion from the scalability. And just to connect this and let you comment, David mentioned consciousness, and John laid out an evolution from data to information to knowledge to wisdom. And I'd like to tack consciousness onto the end of that continuum and say as the context increases, what you end up is you move from data to consciousness. And until there is a conscious model of how innovation works, we're doomed. So.
I applaud that. That's the kind of evolutionary thinking that is the only way we can make progress for that. And there has to be a lot of changes like that. And so we'll see. If I could remember better back on the details you said, I have some more specific things, but I'm sorry, I couldn't hold it in my head. But anyway, what I would really like to see is some real dialogue going on in the world, and it'd be a pleasure to be part of it. It's one of the things that, you know, when I say these things over the years like this, and I get no follow-through discussion, so it gets kind of lonesome.
It need not be lonesome if one of you would ask a penetrating question, and in Doug Engelbart's comment about controversial issues such as religious issues, how many of you here in this room have been writing about stem cell research as a nice controversial topic that we can raise? Yes, Erica?
Yes, I've written about it, but in Sweden it's not that controversial as it is here. So I think maybe it's not applicable.
It certainly is applicable on a global scale, even if an evolved country such as Sweden considers it a normal evolution of medicine and medical technology and biotechnology. And I don't want Doug to feel lonely about entering this discussion, and hope that now here you will ask questions in front of everybody, and then afterwards you will collar Doug and nail him down. And we have another question. Please state who you are and your question.
Yeah, Jeff Schwartz with Disruptive Strategies, actually in response to your question about stem cell research. It is interesting that Irv Weissman, who's the father of stem cell research here at Stanford University, is involved in a very political situation, whereas he argues that almost every single article that comes out about stem cell research is in fact coming from one side or the other of the political spectrum, because so far they haven't proven to be able to cure cancer with it yet. So it's interesting that the article is actually generated by the PR departments within these political parties. What would you say about the fact, this is directed to David, what would you say about the problem with diminishing resources at, say, the New York Times, where they go through the Rolodex and they go, aha, Irv Weissman on one side, and you know, some religious person on the right side, and it becomes a 50-50 story, as opposed to what Irv would like is 90-10.
Me? Or Doug?
You, David.
Both.
Me? Oh, right. Well, I think that, you know, now we're talking about the mechanisms in journalism, and if I understand you right, so the sources and finding the story and so on. And in an earlier life, earlier project, I thought of a problem that most of the input into media is other media. So when something new happens, somebody picks up an expert, and then that expert gets known in the media, and then the other media pick up the same expert. And this is a mechanism that can lead to what I would call random gurus. I think it is important for journalists to handle this growing complexity that Doug explained so nicely, and find more sources, and sort of compete more with trying to get the original stories. I think, you know, if you think of this as an organism, if you think of it as a human being, by the way, is that there is a model in robotics when one tries to mimic humans by having competing emotions, competing sort of actions in the body, and then one goes for one of them. And I think that this is also the sense in society, that one has lots of competing impulses, and one is all the time competing for the attention of the collective organism in order to reach some kind of critical mass where one can accomplish something to happen. This is the job of PR. It is what supplies the business model for journalism, because journalism somehow gets this attention which gives critical mass without really caring about what the attention is about. One is sort of very free and open. One is not supposed to run any specific agenda. Then you become a PR person or a lobbyist. And therefore, this sort of creates what I would call the innovation communication ecosystem, would be that the journalists together with the PR people would become like the, not so much the sensory, but anyway the perceptual system in this capability infrastructure, with a competition between different impulses to get the attention and reach critical mass in the system to manifest itself. It's got some kind of ecology of ideas.
And in part, of course, through the internet, we do have collective global mind. And Doug's comment earlier on about being able to hyperlink to the status of an argument would provide access to the journalists and to their sources, enabling a perceptive journalist to dig down, to drill down through all of those sources and see other sources of comment and information. There must be more questions for Doug. As we say, we don't want him to be lonely, and we will have very few opportunities, unfortunately, to see him here.
John, maybe I just interrupt here.
Yes, please, Turo.
I just want to very much know what kind of experiences, have you had with journalists, while your long career? Can you tell some of those?
There was this guy named Markov. I can't think of more. John did a very nice job. And my memory is sort of empty about how much I've had from the press.
So did they realize, the meaning of your inventions at the time?
Why would they do it more than all the colleagues and everything else that were? For years, it would just seem to be that I was judged to be a little way off the base. And he's a nice guy, but do you hear what he says about things? And can you imagine when, at a time when there may be 4 to 6 computers in the country, and they're fill a room with racks of vacuum tubes and such, and people just fighting to get a chance to dump some cards in there to get a process out of it. If somebody's talking about using computers interactively, and it just, nothing I could say about the scaling and the probable impact of that, and the time sharing that came out of it later seemed to help. It was just ludicrous. And I came to realize later that it would be sort of like if you find somebody propounding that we get active about it and everybody can have his own helicopter. Oh, sure. So anyway, I'm sure that journalism must there's a line that has to meet all the time about how it's perceived, as how far off base it is. And there's a point at which if it's off base, that means off from what's commonly perceived, it'll just be laughed at.
Peter Magnuson for Doug. Doug, you seem young and vibrant, and I was at Microprocessor Forum yesterday morning and listened to next generation computing power coming out, 45 nanometer, 32 nanometers. So we're going to continue to have dramatic computational performance improvements. Which areas of software and tools for the next generation do you think we should be focusing on for augmenting human capabilities?
Well, I guess that's the part that could facilitate collaborative dialogue is the one that appeals to me, and part of that is a thing I call a dynamic knowledge repository, which is something that deserves a lot of attention to get there, but for a given knowledge domain, you say, can I have that to have the best possible representation of the current state of understanding of that? And it wants to be dynamic, that it keeps evolving as more knowledge and understanding and analysis is done. And it needs to be something that people can learn very quickly how to go in and learn from it. And eventually, if they want to work at it, they can learn how to enter the argument, or they can often offer counter thoughts and stuff that would have to be dealt with by experts within that logic structure.
We have a final question in this panel session.
Hi, Doug. Sam Perry. I'm sorry, I'm behind your computer from you, so you can't quite see me around to your right. But I just wanted to compliment you on your dynamic logic repository idea, because I think one of the things that we deal with, which we don't like to necessarily talk about as much, is as a society, is information overload as a concern, which deals into this capability infrastructure. And I see it a little bit like Google's founders saying that maybe they're only 5% into what really is going to be search optimization down the road. Perhaps we're just the early stages of really understanding how to use this very core concept of yours. And I'm interested in your view on how it may expand and how it addresses this issue of filtering through information.
Well, it's, that leads me up to saying I need to appeal to somebody that I can wave my hands only so much by myself, that I feel bewildered about what do I need to say, why can't I get this understood, what I'm trying to say. And then I realize, you know, one guy sounding the same year after year, you get sort of dismissed. So what would be really handy is if there could be some kind of social group set up that we can participate in dialogue, so that after a while I feel like, yes, all my thoughts are out there in that recorded dialogue, and it's got a chance to really get paired and shaven and countered, etc., so that what results is something that seems to be, and that's what fits in the understanding of society today. It would just be an immense boon to me to get that kind of going. So I don't know who I could turn to do it.
Come to the Innovation Society meeting next week. We have a group here in Silicon Valley that is just such a cultural group to have this conversation. Seriously, I'll give you a card.
We are the collective beneficiaries here of the marvelous attenuation of Doug's wisdom over decades. And of all of the people that any of us could meet, how many could we say of any of them that they have affected the lives of at least 1 billion people? And I bet that at least 1 billion people have taken mouse in hand and have used the GUI. This concludes this panel session, and we now move on to a new panel session involving, and I'm going to have a little difficulty with the pronunciation of his name, Noam Lemelstrick, who is Dean of the Sami Ofer School of Communications. Logical changes, a must for innovation journalism, professionals and students.
People